Welcome to Preeminent Test Prep. Today I'll be taking you through how to pace the Math with Calculator section of the SAT. I have scored perfectly on the Math section of the SAT on back-to-back SAT tests, and today I'll be giving you my insights into how I recommend pacing that Math with Calculator section. I've also made a video on pacing the Math without Calculator section, so if you want to find that, you can find that on our channel as well. So with that, let's go ahead and get started with how to pace the Math with Calculator section. Also make sure to like, share, and subscribe, and let's go ahead and get started. So the first thing we need to do in understanding how to pace the Math with Calculator section of the SAT is we have to understand how the difficulty of the questions on the SAT Math with Calculator section is arranged. So we have to keep in mind that questions increase in difficulty level from 1 through 30. So the Math with Calculator section has 30 multiple choice questions. Those are the 1 through 30, and questions get increasingly more difficult as you go from 1 to 30. So after questions 1 through 30, you get to the free response questions. The free response questions are questions 31 to 38, and they start at a medium difficulty level, and then they also grow increasingly more difficult over time. So if you're seeing a trend here, you see that questions 1 through 30 are going to grow more difficult over time, and then when we go back to 31, 31 isn't going to be as hard as 30 was. It's going to start at a more moderate difficulty level, and then it's going to build up in difficulty as it goes from there. Okay, so the next thing we need to do in understanding why we're going to pace this the way we should and how I recommend pacing is understanding how question difficulty, how their difficulties are related or equivalent. Okay, so understanding that questions 31 to 32 of the free response, where we fill in our blank, in my opinion, they tend to be about equal in difficulty to questions 1 through 16 of the multiple choice. So that what I mean by that is if you were to take any random multiple choice questions from 1 through 16, and you took a random free response question from 31 or 32, they're likely to be about the same in difficulty. Okay, so that's what I mean by that. Next, we need to understand that questions 33 to 34 on the free response, they're approximately, in my opinion, generally equivalent to questions 8 through 20 on the multiple choice. So what that means, if we were to have a 33 or a 34 on that free response section, it's likely that it's going to be about equivalent in difficulty to a question from 8 to 20 on the multiple choice. Okay, now questions 35 and 36 from the free response, we see that they're generally equal to about questions 10 through 25 of the multiple choice in difficulty. Keep in mind this is my opinion. And then questions 37 to 38 of the free response, in my opinion, tend to be generally equivalent in difficulty to questions 16 through 25. Okay, so if you've noticed something, you've noticed what about questions 26 to 30? Okay, we see that they don't have any equivalency right here. Well, in my opinion, and you'll notice that there's a little bit of overlap here because I say questions 24 through 30. Questions 24 through 30, in my opinion, on the multiple choice, they tend to be the most difficult out of all of the problems on the Math with Calculator section. So what I mean by this is if you were to take questions 1 through 38, so all of the questions on the Math with Calculator section, generally, in my opinion, questions 24 through 30 are the ones that are most likely to be the most difficult out of all of those questions. So in my opinion, generally on the SAT, if you have questions 24 or 25 or 26 through 30, they're more than likely going to be the hardest problems out of that whole Math with Calculator section. So how is this going to impact our strategy, right? We want to understand not only what the difficulties are of these questions, but how does that affect how we should pace the SAT Math with Calculator section, right? How is it going to impact our strategy? Well, we want to answer the easiest questions first, okay, because we get the same amount of points for answering questions 1, 2, and 3 as we do for answering 30, even though questions 1, 2, and 3 tend to be much, much easier than question 30 is. So we want to make sure we're answering the easiest questions first, and then we also want to make sure we're avoiding wasting too much time flipping between pages, okay, because if we're flipping back and forth between the free response and the multiple choice all the time, that's going to waste time, and we want to understand that we need time to not be wasted on the SAT Math section because it's a timed test. Okay, so what is my suggested approach? Well, this is my recommendation for how you should pace yourself on the SAT Math with Calculator section, in my opinion. The first thing that I would do is I would answer multiple choice questions 1 through 18. So the reason that I recommend doing this is multiple choice questions 1 through 18, they tend not to be too difficult. They tend to go from a very, very easy difficulty, in my opinion, to a fairly moderate difficulty. So we're really approaching those easy to moderate difficulty questions, going from easy increasingly to the moderate difficulty questions. And then after 18, we get to questions 19. Okay, for 19 to 22, at that point, those questions are no longer really easy questions. At minimum, they're generally going to be moderate questions, so moderate difficulty, possibly to a high difficulty at 22. So my recommendation is the first thing that you want to do, in my opinion, is going to be answer questions 1 through 18. Then, after you've answered questions 1 through 18, take a look at 19 and 20, okay, or 19 to 22. Now, I don't mean look at 19, then look at 20, then look at 21, then look at 22, and then go back and answer 19. I mean, you answer question 18, then you look at 19. If 19 looks easy, then you go ahead and you solve it, right? Go ahead and do them next. Then if 20 looks easy, go ahead and do it. If 21 looks easy, go ahead and do it. If 22 looks easy, go ahead and do it. Now, if at any point in 19 through 22 you approach a problem that looks difficult, then what I recommend that you do is come back to it after step 3, which is answering free response questions 31 to 35. So after you've answered multiple choice 1 through 18, my recommendation is you go from 19 to 22, and if you find any of them that seem difficult, at the one that seems difficult, go ahead and switch over to the free response questions 31 to 35. Now, if none of 19 through 22 seem difficult, then go ahead and answer all the way to 22, and then at that point, I would recommend switching over to the free response and answering 31 to 35. Okay, so keep in mind that that's because those questions 23 to 30 are likely to be more difficult than questions 31 to 35. So we want to make sure we're answering those easier questions first, but at the same time, like I said, where this arrow is pointing, we want to make sure we're avoiding wasting too much time by flipping between the free response and multiple choice sections. So this, in my opinion, is the best way to do that. Okay, so after you've answered questions 31 to 35 of the free response, the next thing that I recommend you do is that you glance at 36 to 38. So 36 to 38, sometimes they're not too difficult. Sometimes they're only really a moderate difficulty. There are certain occasions where they could be possibly fairly difficult. So what I recommend you do after answering your 31 to 35 is take a look at 36 to 38. Once again, I wouldn't recommend taking a look at like 36, then reading 37, then reading all of 38. But just go ahead and take a look at 36. If it looks easy to solve, go ahead and solve it. Take a look at 37. If it looks easy to solve, solve it. If 38 looks easy to solve, solve it. So if they look easy to you, I'd recommend going ahead and doing them next. Okay. Now, if they look difficult, then what I would recommend doing is coming back to them after step 5. Okay, so keep in mind at this point, you just answered 31 to 35. Let's say that you glance at 36 to 38. They look easy. Go ahead and answer them. And then at that point, go back to the multiple choice and answer the rest of the multiple choice questions that you have not answered yet. Right, so that could be anywhere from 19 to 30 or from 23 to 30, anywhere around there. So answering the rest of those multiple choice ones, and then if you didn't answer 36 to 38 in step 4, then go back and answer those. Now, if you already answered 36 to 38, right, they looked easy to you, you went ahead and solved them, then all you got to do is go back and answer the rest of your multiple choice. Now, if you look at 36 to 38, they look difficult, then you're going to have to go to the multiple choice, answer as many of those as you can until it seems that the next multiple choice question would be more difficult than going back and answering 36 to 38. So if you get to 29 or 30 on the multiple choice section and you're like, man, this looks really difficult and like it's going to take me a really long time, and you remember on the free response when you glanced at 36 didn't seem necessarily harder than 29 and 30 did, then you'd want to go back and answer 36 to 38, then go back and do 29 and 30. So there is a little bit of subjectivity to this, but in general, this is the guideline, this right here, my suggested approach. This would be my outline that I would recommend doing for pacing the SAT math with calculator section. And keep in mind, this is coming from someone who scored perfectly on the SAT math section on back-to-back SATs. So that is, I would say that I do have credibility in this area. Okay, so with that, I want to go ahead and cover why this approach is smart. So if you're taking notes on this, the big thing that I think you should take notes on, I'm going to put it in blue here, would be this right here, okay, where this arrow is pointing. So all the way from this this 2 right here, the 2 I's, all the way down to this 5 right here. So I'd really try to make sure that you have steps 1 through 5 along with these 2 A, B's right here as well. Okay, so if you're taking notes, those would be the really big takeaways you're going to want to have here. All right, so let's just cover why this approach is smart real quick, right? Because we want to make sure that we understand why it's smart, because if you understand why it's smart, then you're going to be more likely to adopt it. And in my opinion, if you adopt it, I think that you're going to be much more likely to be efficient and make sure you're managing your time the best that you can with the SAT math with calculator section. So let's go ahead and cover why it's smart. Well, the first thing it's going to do is it's going to maximize your chances at points, since answering questions 1 or question 2 or question 3 gives you the same amount of points as answering question 30 correct. Okay, so keep in mind that if you answer question 1 on the math with calculator section and you get it right, that's going to give you the same amount of points as answering question 30. But question 30 is a lot more likely to be difficult. Okay, question 1 is generally pretty easy and question 30 is generally pretty hard. But if we're getting the same amount of points on the test for answering 1 as 30, we want to make sure we're answering 1 first because it'll take us less time to get the same amount of points. Okay, so you want to understand how the SAT math section is scored as a whole, and the way that it's scored is it takes your total number of correct answers between your math with calculator section and without calculator section, and it divides it by the 58 total questions possible. Okay, so there's 20 possible questions on the math without calculator section, and there's 38 on the math with calculator section. So that adds to a total of 58 questions. So you're graded on your total that you get correct out of 58. So the number you get correct out of 58 is how your score is determined. It's not based on certain questions being worth more than others. All the questions are worth the same because it takes your score based on the number correct you get out of 58. So that's an important thing to understand. All right, next. By adopting this approach, it's going to prevent you from running out of time while working on a hard problem and leaving points on the table. So what I mean by this is if you're working on, say, question 30, right? Let's say you're working on question 30, but you haven't answered 31 or 32 or 33 or 34 yet. Well, question 30 is more likely to be significantly more difficult than question 31 or 32 is. So by answering question 30 before 31 or 32, if you run out of time while you're working on question 30, well, you just left a lot of points on the table because there's a decent chance you could have answered 31, 32, and 33 in the same amount of time it took you to answer 30. Or at least if you're doing, say that you're doing questions 24 through 30 instead of doing 31 through 36 first. Well, questions 24 through 30, there's also probably a more likely chance that you're going to get those wrong than if you were to answer 31 to 36. So even if they were to take you the same amount of time, you're more likely to get questions 31 to 36 right than questions 24 to 30 right, in my opinion, because in my opinion, questions 31 to 36 tend to be easier, right? So that's an important thing to understand. Okay, so in that sense, it's very, very efficient. Okay, this is really, in my opinion, the most efficient way you can do it. Now, you may be thinking, well, why wouldn't I just go back and forth between the multiple choice and free response sections? Because if I go back to my equivalency chart, you may be thinking, well, shouldn't I answer 1 through 16 or 1 through 10 or something, then go answer 31 through 32, then do 33 through 34, then go back and do 8 through 20? Well, here's the reason that I wouldn't do that. Okay, I wouldn't do that because that's going to waste a lot of time flipping between pages. Okay, so keep in mind that it is a balance, right? So it's a balance between avoiding time, too much time flipping between the free response and multiple choice and answering those easier questions first. So I feel like this is the best way to balance it. That's what I would recommend. That's what I would do if I were taking the SAT again. So just one quick other thing I want to cover. So I know that some people watching this are probably shooting for a perfect score or a near perfect score, and they think that there's really no chance that they're ever going to see a question that they won't know. Now, here's the thing about that. The SAT, it's not given very often, right? It's only given, I think, around 8 times a year or something like that. Don't quote me on that, but if you're only given this test about 8 times a year and you're going to have to wait another 1 or 2 months or 3 months to take it, you really want to make sure that you're just not leaving any points on the table, because even if you're shooting for a perfect score, if you get a 1580 or a 1590 and you missed one question on the math section, that's still a really, really great score. And if you're talking about having to spend another 2 months of studying to get that extra 10 points to get a perfect score, you may think it's worth it now, but after taking the test, you may think, well, if I would have just gotten a 1590 by taking this strategy and not getting stuck on question 30 and missing questions 31 to 38, then I would have gotten maybe a 1580 instead of something a lot lower than that because I was so obsessed with getting a perfect score. So if you're shooting for a perfect score, I still think that this is the best strategy for you because it's still going to make sure you're maximizing your potential points on the table. So I still think that this is the best strategy if you're shooting for a perfect score. So understand, you should still use this strategy if you're shooting for a perfect score, in my opinion. I think that it's the most efficient way to do it. I don't think that there is any more efficient way to do it, and I think that this would be the best way in my opinion. This is the strategy that I used, and this is the strategy that I would recommend you use as well. All right, so how much time should I have left after answering all the questions? So this is another big part with pacing for the math with calculator section. We don't just want to finish all of our questions in 55 minutes. We want to actually finish them in less than 55 minutes. That way we have time to go through and make sure that our bubble sheet matches our booklet and check any problems that we struggled with. So what do I recommend? Well, I recommend having 20 to 15 minutes left to check your work if that's possible. Now, some people aren't very quick at math, and it may not be possible for them to answer all of those questions in 35 or 40 minutes. Now, I understand that, and if you can't finish that quickly, then I recommend at least trying to have all your questions answered with 10 minutes left. Okay, so that would mean you'd have 45 minutes to answer your questions and 10 minutes left to go through and check your bubble sheet, make sure it matches your test booklet, and check any work that you want to check as far as problems that were a little bit more difficult or that you weren't as sure of. Now, keep in mind, Ideally, in my opinion, you should try to aim to have 20 to 15 minutes left at the end to check your work. So that would mean you're finishing in about 35 to 40 minutes. Okay, now keep in mind, like I said, some people it's more difficult to finish that quickly. That's okay. Just try to have at least 10 minutes left if you can, in my opinion. All right, so why? Why do we want to have a little bit of time left at the end? Well, there's a few things I recommend checking in those final minutes, those final 15 minutes, 20 minutes, 10 minutes, 5 minutes, however long you have. There are some things that I would recommend checking. So the first thing is to check your bubble sheet. Okay, so you want to make sure that it matches your booklet. So part of this is understanding a bubbling strategy, right? So not everyone uses a bubbling strategy, but I would recommend using one. And the one that I would recommend is the following. This is what I used, and this is what I would recommend you use as well. So, yes, there is a bubbling strategy. Yes, I am a tryhard on the SAT math section, so much so that I have a bubbling strategy. Okay, this bubbling strategy is designed to save you as much time as it can, because the whole point of the SAT is it being timed. The fact that it's timed is what makes it difficult. The math in it isn't actually, in my opinion, that difficult. It's just the fact that it's time, and having to manage that time is what makes it difficult for some people. So here's what I recommend doing. I recommend circling your answer in your test booklet. So you solve your problem, you circle your answer in your test booklet. Now you do that until you've answered all of the questions on that page. Okay, so for the SAT math section with calculator, generally there's going to be about, I believe, 1 or 2, maybe 3, 3 or 4, maybe anywhere from 1 to 4 problems, maybe even 5 on one page. So what I recommend doing is circling your answer in your test booklet, and then once you've answered all the questions on that page, bubbling it in, right? Bubbling it in on your answer sheet. So I believe that it's probably like an average of 3 questions per page, right? So you're going to answer approximately 3 questions, then you're going to go bubble them in. Now the reason that this is going to save you time is because if you were to bubble in after every single answer choice that you find, right? You bubble in after 16, then you're going to have to take your eyes off your test booklet, switch it to your answer sheet, bubble it in, go back to your test booklet, find the next answer. You see it, then you have to go back and bubble it in. You see that you're going to have to switch back and forth between looking at your test booklet and looking at your bubble sheet after every question. But by doing it after every page, then you're only doing that about a third of the time, right? Or as a third of the amount of time that it would take you if you were bubbling after every single question. So that's going to save you some time. So for example, if I was answering questions 1 through 3, they were all on page 1. I went ahead and answered them. Let's say that the order was A, D, A, D, A, right? I just go through, look at my test booklet, I see it goes A, D, A, then I go on my bubble sheet, put in A, D, A, just like that. So by doing that, I'm really saving a lot of time because I don't have to go back and forth between my test booklet and answer sheet as often. So that's what I recommend doing there. Now, one thing to watch out for is the time as you get towards the end. So let's say you're struggling with pacing, right? Let's say that there's less than 8 minutes left. Well, once there's less than 8 minutes left, that's when I abandon this bubbling strategy. So if there's less than 8 minutes left, what I'm going to do is I'm going to fill in the bubble sheet after every question. Just because when there's 8 minutes left, at that point, I don't want to end up in a situation where I have 3 answers in my test booklet and they're all correct, but I just run out of time to transfer them to my bubble sheet. So that's what I'm looking to avoid there. So that's one thing that I would keep in mind for that. Okay, so with that, let's go ahead and go back up to where we left off. So that's what to check in the final minutes. So we talked about matching your bubble sheet to your test booklet. In my opinion, that's very, very important. That's the first thing I would do after I've answered all my questions. So after I've answered all of them, let's say I have 20 minutes left, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go make sure that everything in my bubble sheet matches to what my answers in my test booklet are. After that, I'm going to go through and I'm going to check my work on any problems that I struggled with or that took me a fair amount of time or that were more difficult. I'm going to go ahead and check my work on those. Now, if you have a lot of time, what I'm going to recommend doing is, as far as checking your work, you might not have time to check all of the questions. So that's just one thing to understand. You're probably, for most people, it might not be possible, or at least you might not be ready or have enough time left to go back and check the answers to all your questions. Because if it took you 35 minutes to answer 1 through 38, if you're going back and checking them, it's going to be tough to check all of them in 20 minutes or 15 minutes or 10 minutes. So as far as checking work, the priority in my opinion would be this. So you've already checked your bubble sheet, matched it to your test booklet. I would say the priority for checking your work would be number 1, any problems that you starred. So any starred problems. So any problems that you found were more difficult or that you want to check in the end, those are the ones I would do first. So another part of that is making sure that if there is a problem that you want to make sure you check your work at the end because you're not totally sure, star it. That way you know when you have time left, go back and check your work on that one first. Okay, so number 2, the next thing that I would do is I would go through and I would check my work on any problems that were some of the more difficult ones, or just really anything at all that there was any sort of hesitancy on. So any sort of thing that I was hesitant on, any answer that I wasn't totally sure of, I would go back and check those. After that, you really are just checking any of them that you have a gut feeling you should check, or at that point just start checking them. If you're not sure, you've already done ones that were starred, any of them you were hesitant on, at that point just start checking work, because if you still got time left, you still want to be checking work. So that's my recommendation there. So I believe that that takes us through everything in this pacing video. Like I said earlier, the big takeaway in my opinion would be this right here, my suggested approach. I think that this is a really good strategy. I've based it on looking at my test results because I've taken the SAT a couple times, so I based it on looking at the difficulty of questions and how it was arranged on those tests. I also examined a few practice tests to kind of see how it looked through that. I also, in my lead up to taking the SAT, I took double digits of practice tests. I don't even know how many, but it was a lot. It was definitely over 12, probably closer to 17 or 16 or 15. So I've got a lot of experience with this. This is really, before making this video, I combed through practice tests to make sure that I was kind of getting the right order as far as difficulty goes. And in my opinion, this is kind of the best way, in my opinion, as someone who scored perfectly on the math section back to back. So hopefully this video was helpful. I have a 90-day free SAT prep course up on my channel. If you want to check that out, I think that that'd probably be very helpful. And with that, make sure to like, share, and subscribe, and I'll catch you on the next video.